On the morning of October 18th, 2019, a woman named Nadia locked her apartment in Beirut's Hamra district and walked to the branch of her bank 2 streets away. She was not panicking. She had read the news, the protests, the government's proposed tax on WhatsApp calls, the growing noise about the state of Lebanese public finances. But she had a salary, a savings account with 11 years of accumulated deposits, and a bank that had stood on that corner for longer than she had been alive. She wanted to withdraw $3,000, a portion of what she had saved. Enough to feel, she told a journalist 2 years later, like she was doing something sensible without overreacting. The bank was closed. A handwritten note on the door cited security concerns related to the ongoing protests. She came back the next day. The bank was open, but dollar withdrawals had been quietly capped. Not announced, not explained in any official communication. Simply capped at a level far below what she had requested. Over the following 30 days, Nadia watched something happen that she had understood intellectually. She had read about Argentina, about Cyprus, about the Asian financial crisis, but had never processed as something that could happen to her account, on her street, in her city. The number in her account did not change. 11 years of savings remained visible on the screen. But what that number could actually do in the world, what it could buy, where it could go, who would accept it at face value, changed almost daily. Not gradually, in lurches. Each week of that first month brought a new restriction, a new informal rule, a new reality that had not existed the week before. By day 30, Nadia had accessed a fraction of her savings. The rest existed on a screen. Whether it would ever fully exist anywhere else was a question that, 3 years later, still did not have a clean answer. This is what a currency crisis looks like from the inside. Not the headlines, not the exchange rate charts, the 30 days from the moment an ordinary person realizes something has changed to the moment they understand what the new rules are. That window, 30 days, roughly, is where most of the damage happens. Not because the crisis is worst in that window, but because the decisions made in that window, under pressure and with incomplete information, determine most of what comes next. The surface question is, what happens to savings in a currency crisis? The answer is that they lose value, purchasing power, or accessibility. That answer is true and insufficient. The deeper question is, what happens in what sequence, and does the sequence matter? It does, more than almost anything else. Go to Mexico. December 20th, 1994. Day 0 for the peso crisis arrived with an announcement from the Mexican government that it was widening the peso's trading band against the dollar. In effect, a managed devaluation. The announcement was intended to be controlled. It was not. Within 2 days, the peso had fallen 15% against the dollar. Within 2 weeks, it had fallen close to 50%. Foreign capital, which had been flowing into Mexican markets through the early 1990s, reversed with extraordinary speed. The mechanism was a modern one. Capital flows that had moved in through electronic systems moved out through the same systems, faster than any previous financial crisis had allowed. For an ordinary Mexican saver with a peso savings account, day 0 to day 30 looked like this. Days 1 through 3, confusion. The devaluation had been announced, but the full scale was not yet visible. Banks were open, ATMs were functioning. The official communication from the government was measured. Most ordinary savers did nothing, because nothing in their immediate environment told them they needed to act immediately. Days 4 through 10, the queue. As the peso continued to fall and the news coverage became impossible to ignore, savers began appearing at banks. Not a run, not yet, but a sustained increase in withdrawal requests and currency conversion inquiries. Banks began managing the queue. Some began imposing informal limits. The savers who arrived earliest in this window received better service than those who arrived later. Days 11 through 20. The conversion panic. By this point, the peso had lost a third of its value and showed no sign of stabilizing. The savers who had waited, who had spent the first 10 days telling themselves the situation would be resolved, now tried to convert pesos into dollars simultaneously. The exit price for that conversion had moved dramatically against them in the 10 days they had waited. Days 21 through 30. The new reality. The International Monetary Fund and the United States government assembled a rescue package. The peso stabilized, at its new, much lower level. The crisis had not ended. Mexico experienced a severe recession through 1995, with unemployment rising sharply and real wages falling. But the acute 30-day window had passed. The savings of Mexican households denominated in pesos had lost, in dollar terms, roughly half their value in those 30 days. The losses were not distributed equally. The savers who had converted earlier, even at suboptimal rates, had preserved more than those who waited. The savers who had held dollar accounts or dollar-denominated instruments had experienced the crisis almost entirely as observers rather than as victims. The timing of the decision mattered more than the decision itself. Here is the reversal that makes the 30-day pattern more complicated. Because Iceland in 2008 should, by the logic of the Mexican case, have been catastrophic for ordinary Icelandic savers. The Icelandic banking system collapsed in October 2008 with extraordinary speed. The three major banks, Kaupthing, Landsbanki, and Glitnir, had assets equivalent to roughly 10 times Iceland's GDP. When they failed, the failure was total. By any prior measure of banking crisis severity, Iceland 2008 was one of the most complete institutional collapses in modern financial history. And yet, ordinary Icelandic savers with domestic deposits were largely protected. The Icelandic government made a deliberate decision, controversial, legally contested, ultimately upheld, to prioritize domestic depositors over foreign creditors in the resolution of the failed banks. Foreign investors who had placed money in Icelandic accounts chasing higher interest rates lost heavily. Ordinary Icelandic households lost their access to foreign currency and experienced a severe devaluation of the krona. But their domestic savings, denominated in krónur, remained accessible. The first 30 days in Iceland looked different from the first 30 days in Mexico. The banking system was closed briefly. Capital controls were imposed, the krona fell sharply, but the specific mechanism that had destroyed Lebanese and Mexican savings, the inaccessibility or devaluation of domestic deposits held by ordinary savers, was partially interrupted by government intervention. Iceland did not escape the crisis. It experienced a severe recession. Real wages fell. Unemployment rose. The recovery took years and required painful fiscal adjustment. But the 30-day window for ordinary Icelandic savers was less destructive than the same window in Beirut or Mexico City, not because the crisis was less severe, but because the institutional response was faster and more explicitly protective of domestic depositors. This matters because it challenges a simple reading of the pattern. Currency crises do not uniformly destroy domestic savings in 30 days. They destroy savings in proportion to two things: the speed of the devaluation or restriction and the speed and direction of the institutional response. Both variables were present in Iceland. Only the first was present in Lebanon. That distinction, between a crisis where institutions respond in ways that protect ordinary savers and a crisis where they do not, is not something that can be determined from inside the 30-day window. It can only be assessed imperfectly from the institutional environment that existed before day zero arrived. If you want to understand how different institutional frameworks have historically handled the protection of ordinary depositors during currency crises, and what the track record actually looks like across different countries and crisis types, That is exactly what the next video goes into. Go to Russia. August 17th, 1998, the Russian government announced a default on domestic debt, a devaluation of the ruble, and a moratorium on foreign debt payments simultaneously. The announcement came on a Monday morning. By the end of that week, the ruble had lost more than half its value against the dollar. For ordinary Russians with ruble savings accounts, the first 30 days were a compression of every stage of the Mexican timeline into a shorter, more violent window. Days 1 through 3 were not confusion. The announcement had been explicit, and the population had been living with deteriorating economic conditions for months. The Q phase began almost immediately. Banks were overwhelmed within days. But here is what the Russian case adds to the pattern that Mexico and Iceland do not provide as clearly. A significant portion of the Russian population, not wealthy by global standards, but experienced in the instability of the post-Soviet transition, had already converted a portion of their savings into dollars held at home. Not in banks, in cash, in apartments, in the informal storage systems that Russians had developed through the economic chaos of the early 1990s. Those savings were not affected by the banking system's response to the crisis. They were outside it. The ruble devaluation actually increased their purchasing power in ruble terms. They could now buy more rubles with the same dollars than they could have the week before. This was not sophisticated financial planning. It was the accumulated experience of a population that had watched the ruble collapse before, in 1991 and again in the early 1990s, and had drawn a simple practical conclusion: keep something outside the system that the system cannot reach. The 30-day window in Russia in 1998 divided savers along a single line. Those who were entirely within the ruble banking system suffered the full impact of the devaluation. Those who had kept even a portion of their savings in a form outside the banking system, in dollars, in physical goods, in whatever held value independently of the ruble, experienced the crisis partially rather than totally. The margin between those two outcomes was not measured in sophistication. It was measured in the decision, made months or years before August 1998, to hold something that the system could not reprice overnight. Now look at what the psychological research on crisis behavior and the testimonies collected from survivors of multiple currency crises reveals about the sequence of decisions ordinary savers make in the first 30 days. Because the sequence is not random, and it is almost identical across cases that differ in country, currency, decade, and cause. Days 1 through 3, normalization. The first response to visible crisis signals is almost universally an attempt to fit the signals into the existing framework. The bank is closed today, but it will open tomorrow. The exchange rate has moved, but it will correct. The government has made an announcement, but governments make announcements. This phase is not stupidity. It is the same cognitive process that makes humans functional in stable times, the tendency to interpret new information through established patterns, working against the saver in a moment when the established pattern has broken. Days 4 through 10. The gathering. Information accumulates past the point where normalization is sustainable. Savers begin talking to each other. Checking accounts more frequently, visiting banks to ask questions. This is the phase where action is still relatively unconstrained, where the exit prices for conversion are still better than they will be later, where queues are still manageable, where the institutional systems are still processing requests at something close to normal speed. It is also the phase where most people are still not acting decisively. Days 11 through 20. The simultaneous decision, the critical mass of savers who have moved through the normalization and gathering phases simultaneously reach the decision to act. This is the phase where queues become unmanageable, where conversion rates move sharply against the seller, where the exit price deteriorates most rapidly. The people who act in this phase are not late by the standards of their own psychological timeline. They have processed the information and responded. But they are late by the standards of the exit price available to them. The simultaneous nature of the decision is what destroys the exit price. Days 21 through 30, recalibration. The acute phase passes one way or another. Either institutional intervention changes the rules, or a new equilibrium, however painful, establishes itself. Savers who still have accessible funds begin making decisions in a more stable, if much worse, environment. Those who do not have accessible funds begin navigating whatever recovery process the institutional system offers. The pattern is not a prediction of any specific crisis. Most currencies in most countries do not experience this 30-day sequence in any given decade. Most savings accounts in most countries function exactly as promised for the entire lifetimes of the people who hold them. The stability of financial institutions in most places and most times is real and not to be dismissed. But the 30-day window, when it arrives, is not kind to the savers who are still in the normalization phase when everyone else has moved to simultaneous decision. Come back to Nadia in Hamra in October 2019, walking to the bank 2 streets from her apartment. Not panicking, doing something sensible without overreacting. She was in the normalization phase, the gathering phase. Arriving at the bank and finding it closed was, for her, the beginning of the gathering. She came back the next day. She asked questions. She processed information. She moved through the psychological sequence at a pace that felt, from the inside, like responsible caution. The exit prices available to her at each successive stage of that 30-day window were worse than the ones available the day before. Not because she was slow, because the sequence is not designed to reward the saver. It is designed, if designed is even the right word for something that emerges from collective human behavior under pressure, to transfer value from those who move late to those who moved early. The question the 30-day pattern raises is not, what should you do in a currency crisis? By day 0, most of the meaningful decisions have already been made or foreclosed. The question is simpler and harder. How much of what you currently hold is positioned such that the 30-day window, if it ever arrives, finds you already past the normalization phase? Already holding something outside the system that the system cannot reprice overnight? Already in some meaningful proportion of your savings, on the right side of the sequence? That positioning is not decided in the first 30 days. It is decided in whatever quiet period precedes them. The 30 days are just when you find out what you decided.